The Beatles, a household name for anyone who's into 60s rock, are often called the most influential band ever. What makes them so iconic around the world? Well, it's partly down to Paul McCartney, who many consider the heart of the group. But here's the twist. What really catches people's attention about Paul isn't just his legendary work with the Beatles, but the tough times and losses he's had throughout his life. In this video, we'll clear up some of the mysteries surrounding Paul McCartney's journey. Let's take a look at Paul's early years. When Paul was just 14, tragedy hit his family in 1956. His mom passed away from breast cancer, and this was a huge blow for him. This heartbreak is said to have inspired the Beatles' famous song Let It Be, and might even have had an impact on the emotional lyrics of Yesterday. In an interview with Stephen Colbert, Paul admitted that at first, he didn't really think his mom's death affected his music directly, but over time he realized just how much her absence shaped his songs. Paul also opened up about his close bond with fellow Beatle John Lennon. Both shared a deep love for music, but they were also united by the painful experience of losing their mothers when they were teenagers. John's mom died when he was only 17, just after he met Paul, which created a special connection between them. It was like they found a bit of light in each other, despite their own struggles. After the departure of Stuart Sutcliffe, the Beatles' original bassist who left to pursue other artistic interests, the band had a real problem. They needed a replacement. According to Ultimate Classic Rock in 1960, they first tried to fill Stewart's spot with Chas Newby, but he wasn't around for long. This left Paul in a tricky position. He was originally the lead guitarist, but suddenly the band didn't have a bassist. In a moment of uncertainty, Paul found himself having to step in. He remembered it like this. It was like, uh-oh, we haven't got a bass player, and everyone just sort of turned to me. I kind of got stuck with it. It was like, well, I guess it'll have to be you then. I don't think you'd have seen John doing it. So Paul went from lead guitar to bass guitar, marking a huge shift in the band's lineup. And little did anyone know, this change would shape the Beatles' future sound in ways no one could have predicted. Paul McCartney continued to roll with the changes as the Beatles evolved. When his guitar stopped working, he didn't hesitate to pick up the piano, embracing the fact that things were shifting. By this point, Paul had fully accepted his role as the band's bassist. Although it wasn't his first choice of instrument, he threw himself into it with his usual determination and creativity. His ability to adapt didn't go unnoticed. Rolling Stone even ranked him number 9 on their list of the 50 greatest bassists of all time, a well-deserved nod to his skill. As the Beatles' career progressed, John Lennon became the band's charismatic leader. But by the mid-1960s, something began to shift, and the balance of power subtly passed into Paul's hands. With this new leadership, the band hit new heights, but it also sparked tension within the group. This change began in 1964, when Paul made a bold move by stepping away from his songwriting partnership with John. He wrote Can't Buy Me Love, which ended up on their next album. John, feeling the artistic rivalry, responded with A Hard Day's Night and most of the tracks on their upcoming record. This back and forth of musical competition became a defining feature of their creative relationship throughout the rest of the decade. Whenever Paul wrote a hit like Yesterday, John would counter with a masterpiece like Strawberry Fields Forever. Paul even joked that the competition kept them both on their toes. But, as noted by Far Out magazine, this rivalry didn't always sit well with John. Paul's success sometimes got under John's skin, leading to moments of tension between them. This friendly yet intense musical tug-of-war shaped some of the Beatles' best work, but also laid the groundwork for the conflicts that would eventually arise within the band. In the mid-60s, the Beatles' creative dynamics began to shift. As the 1960s went on, John Lennon started to feel like he was losing his grip on the band's musical direction. Paul McCartney, however, stepped up in a big way, becoming not only a powerhouse songwriter, but also an instrumentalist, arranger, producer, and the unofficial musical leader of the band. The close collaboration that defined the Beatles' early days had begun to evolve into something more complex, with each member asserting their own artistic vision. This shift marked the start of a more complicated and sometimes fraught period for the band. In 1966, a strange and persistent rumor started circulating that Paul McCartney had died in a car accident and had been secretly replaced by a look-alike. According to Ultimate Classic Rock, this bizarre theory emerged while the Beatles were working on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The rumor claimed that instead of finding a new band member, the surviving Beatles had decided to continue their musical journey with a McCartney look-alike. Rolling Stone traced the origin of the story to a mysterious caller who convinced radio DJ Russ Gibb to play the White Album backwards. The caller claimed it would reveal hidden messages, such as, "Turn me on, dead man," and John Lennon supposedly saying, "I buried Paul." Despite McCartney being very much alive, the rumor gained traction, helped along by supposed clues in the Beatles' album covers, song lyrics, and even music videos. For example, some fans interpreted the Abbey Road album cover as a funeral procession, with McCartney symbolically cast as the deceased. To squash the rumor, Life magazine sent reporters to find Paul at his Scottish farm. Rolling Stone recalls how McCartney responded by throwing a bucket of water at the journalist before agreeing to an interview and photo shoot to set the record straight. But even after this, the myth just wouldn't die. Paul, or the supposed imposter, continued to face questions about the rumor throughout the years. He even addressed it during a 2009 appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman. But by the time the 1960s were drawing to a close, the Beatles were struggling with internal tensions. The death of their manager Brian Epstein in 1967 left a massive leadership gap and exposed the cracks in what had once been a close-knit group. Without Epstein's steady hand, the Beatles began to unravel, setting the stage for the challenges that would follow. As tensions within the Beatles grew, creative disagreements began to surface, even though they tried to keep things together. On September 20th, 1969, things came to a head. Despite the pleas of their new business manager, Alan Klein, to keep the band intact, John Lennon told Paul McCartney and drummer Ringo Starr that he was leaving the group. This wasn't completely unexpected, though. The Beatles had already been living more separate lives, focusing on their families, marriages, and individual music projects. John's growing involvement with Yoko Ono had made it clear that he needed space to focus on his relationship and his own work. Paul later admitted that deep down, they all knew it was coming. After John's announcement, the Beatles tried to carry on for a while, but the inevitable was clear. On April 10, 1970, Paul officially announced the band's breakup, as reported by People. This marked the end of an era, and shortly after, Paul McCartney began his solo career. He released his first solo album just a week after the Beatles dissolved. This self-titled album marked the beginning of Paul's new artistic direction, where he took full control, writing, playing, and producing every track. At the time, reactions were mixed, but over the years it's come to be seen as one of his standout achievements. Paul's next project, Ram, followed a similar path of initial skepticism. Ultimate classic rock notes that while the album was panned by critics in 1971, today it's considered one of the best post-Beatles albums Paul ever made. Despite the praise it gets now, in its time, Ram faced harsh criticism, with Pitchfork describing it as loathed by contemporaneous reviewers. Next up was Wildlife, which marked the start of Paul's collaboration with his new band, Wings. Unlike his earlier solo albums, Wildlife didn't get a second look from critics. Rolling Stone at the time gave it a brutal review, calling it flaccid musically and impotent lyrically, trivial and unaffecting. Unfortunately, this harsh assessment stuck, and Wildlife is still seen as one of Paul's less impactful works. Despite these ups and downs in his solo career, there's no denying that John Lennon and Paul McCartney's songwriting partnership will forever be one of the most iconic in music history. The journey of John Lennon and Paul McCartney began on July 6, 1957, when fate stepped in during a performance by Lennon's skiffle band, the Quarrymen. A mutual friend introduced McCartney to Lennon, sparking a musical partnership that would go on to change the course of music history. As the Quarrymen evolved into the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney emerged as the band's creative powerhouses, crafting timeless melodies that captivated audiences across generations and took the Beatles to unimaginable heights of fame. However, as the band experienced the intense pressures of worldwide success, cracks began to show in the once unshakable bond between Lennon and McCartney. The Beatles' disintegration marked the beginning of a turbulent period for the pair. Angry letters were exchanged, and their music became a battleground for their personal grievances. McCartney's Too Many People and Lennon's retaliatory How Do You Sleep became symbols of the animosity that had replaced the harmonious collaboration that once defined their relationship. In particular, Lennon's lyrics in How Do You Sleep, with lines like, "The only thing you did was yesterday," and "Since you've gone, you're just another day," reflected the bitterness that had seeped into their friendship. Despite this hostility, time eventually brought about a reconciliation. The wounds from their personal and artistic conflicts began to heal, and they found common ground again in the final years of Lennon's life. Their conversations shifted away from the complicated world of songwriting and focused more on life's simple pleasures, like family and even the joy of baking bread. This new chapter in their friendship was a testament to the lasting bond they shared, forged over years of shared experiences. McCartney later recalled that their last conversation before Lennon's tragic death was marked by a sense of camaraderie. They talked about everyday matters, focusing on family and friendship, rather than the old artistic disputes. According to Linda McCartney, John Lennon's final words to Paul were, "Think about me every now and then, old friend." These remarks were extremely straightforward but profound in their significance. While Paul's connection with George Harrison proved to be even more convoluted than his relationship with John, which was full of highs and lows, Paul's relationship with John was packed with both. The moment that George Harrison played guitar on John Lennon's song "How Do You Sleep" in 1971 was one of the most noteworthy instances of friction that happened between Paul and George James. In spite of this, the dynamic between Paul and George began to change over the course of time, which ultimately resulted in an unexpected turn of events by the year 1974. Not only did John Lennon and Paul McCartney resume their conversation, but they also found themselves participating in a musical collaboration once more. By this time, John Lennon and George Harrison had joined forces with Ringo Starr to collaborate on the composition of songs for Ringo's solo album. Harrison promptly dispelled the idea of a Beatles reunion, indicating that he was reluctant to work with McCartney. This occurred as rumors were circulating about a reunion between the Beatles. He stated, "Paul is a very good bass player, but there are times when he can be a little too dominant. In all honesty, I would be more than happy to join a band that included John Lennon, but I would never be able to join a band that included Paul McCartney." Harrison frequently experienced feelings of being overshadowed by the prominence of Lennon and McCartney inside the Beatles. According to The Guardian, tensions reached their highest point in 1969 when Harrison left the studio, and John Lennon proposed that Eric Clapton be considered for the role of Harrison's replacement. The hostility that existed between McCartney and Harrison remained for a number of years. According to Forbes, it wasn't until the middle of the 1990s that they finally put their disagreements aside and temporarily got back together to perform a mashup of various songs from their discography. Another musical phenomenon that was taking the globe by storm at the same time as the Beatles were nearing the end of their career was the Jackson 5. In the same way that the Beatles did in the 1960s, this family band, which was led by the great Michael Jackson, won over the hearts of their audience. By the 1980s, Michael Jackson had already established himself as a worldwide superstar, and he and Paul McCartney had begun a fascinating musical collaboration. McCartney was the one who initially wrote Girlfriend, a song that was intended for Jackson but ended up being featured on Wings' album London Town in 1978. This was the beginning of their cooperation. Later on, Jackson featured the song on his album titled Off the Wall, which marked the beginning of a creative collaboration that resulted in the creation of a number of singles. These hits included The Girl Is Mine from Jackson's album titled Thriller and Say 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 from McCartney's album titled Pipes of Peace. On the other hand, as their creative partnership developed, a significant divide emerged, this time about the matter of song publishing rights. In light of the fact that McCartney had recently acquired the rights to Buddy Holly's back catalog, he discussed the significance of such ownership with Jackson. The subsequent events would result in tension, which would ultimately eclipse their creative accomplishments. Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney had a conversation about music publishing, and McCartney had no idea that this conversation would result in a significant split. Jackson's purchase of the Beatles catalog, which was the most sought-after collection in the pop music industry at the time, was a move that changed the game in 1985. As a result of this deal, McCartney was quite furious. He vented his irritation by stating, "I think it's dodgy to do something like that, be someone's friend and then buy the rug they're standing on." He was obviously frustrated by the situation. The circumstance became much more precarious when Jackson made the choice to permit the use of music by the Beatles in commercial endeavors, a decision that further infuriated McCartney. While these conflicts were going on, Paul McCartney was going through his own personal journey with love and tragedy. In 1967, photographer Linda Eastman was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to shoot with the Beatles. which was a significant step forward for her professional career. Even before he met the band, Eastman had already established a name for himself in the music industry by collaborating with legendary artists such as Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, and the Grateful Dead. Nevertheless, it was during her time with the Beatles that Paul McCartney took notice of her artistic abilities. On March 12, 1969, they tied the knot after their connection developed into a profound love for one another. They started a family by having 3 children: Mary, Stella, and James. In addition, they were responsible for the upbringing of Heather, who was Linda's daughter from a previous engagement. During the 1970s, Paul and Linda formed the band Wings, which was their first attempt at entering the music world together. They were able to raise their children while juggling their musical activities and tours, despite the fact that they had busy jobs. They always made their family life their top priority. In addition to her work in the music industry, Linda was well known for her photography and was a fervent supporter of vegetarianism and animal rights, both of which were subjects that she thought deeply about. At the same time that Paul's mother had passed away from breast cancer, Linda was diagnosed with the disease in 1995, which was a tragic and unfortunate event. They worked together to overcome this obstacle. But on April 17, 1998, Linda passed away, leaving Paul heartbroken over the loss of his cherished wife. Over the course of an open and honest interview with the BBC, Paul McCartney discussed the emotional toll that the death of his wife, Linda McCartney, had taken on him. He contemplated the fact that, during that period of time, there was a deficiency in both conversation and awareness around breast cancer. Despite the fact that McCartney discussed the stoic stance that individuals used, he also underlined his personal openness toward the grief process. An indication of the profound effect that Linda's passing had on him is the fact that he acknowledged that he went through a period of 1 year that was filled with tears and emotional struggle after she passed away. Immediately following Linda's passing, Paul McCartney embarked on a new phase of his personal life by tying the knot with Heather Mills, a modeling and media figure. On the other hand, this marriage caused his family to experience a range of feelings, particularly from his daughter Stella McCartney, who apparently had some misgivings about her father's decision. However, despite the fact that the couple's union resulted in the birth of their daughter Beatrice, the marriage confronted severe difficulties and finally resulted in the couple's divorce after only 6 years of marriage. The divorce procedures received a great deal of attention from the British press. Ultimate Classic Rock made the observation that McCartney and Mills employed the same legal representation as Prince Charles and Princess Diana did while they were going through their own divorce. Details of the split were made public, despite the fact that efforts were made to handle the situation in a private manner, including the signing of a secrecy agreement. Over the course of the media spectacle, several charges were made from both sides. Mills made allegations of abuse and drug usage against McCartney, while McCartney responded by claiming that Mills was irresponsible and unpleasant to his staff. To add insult to injury, Mills even made the astonishing assertion that Paul had assaulted Linda, his first wife. These allegations were publicly refuted by Stella McCartney, Paul McCartney's daughter with Linda, who expressed her reservations regarding her father's decision to marry Mills. In 2008, the divorce was finalized and Mills was awarded a settlement of $30 million, which was significantly less than the $150 million that she had initially requested. Mills was reprimanded by the judge in the case, who referred to her as a witness who was less than impressive, and pointed out inconsistencies and mistakes in her evidence. Mills defended herself against the harsh criticism that she received from the media by stressing the fact that she had been involved in humanitarian work for more than 20 years. This defense highlighted her efforts outside the difficulties that surrounded her. Even though he was under constant scrutiny from the public, Paul McCartney continued on with his life and married Nancy Shevell in 2011. Since then, their partnership has contributed to the beginning of a more secure and long-lasting chapter in McCartney's personal life. It is possible that many people are unaware of the fact that Paul McCartney has a history of drug usage, which is an intriguing facet of his life. One of the first times that Paul McCartney became involved with drugs was during the early days of the Beatles in Hamburg. At that time, the band was using Preludin to keep their energy levels up for lengthy performances. It was in 1964 that Bob Dylan gave him a joint of marijuana in a hotel room in New York City. This was his first experience with the drug. McCartney remembers that during his first experience he was really high and laughed excessively because of his excitement. After that, marijuana became a consistent component of his life, which had an effect on the way he approached his artistic endeavors. Even the lyrics to Another Kind of Mind and Got to Get You Into My Life were written by McCartney with references to cannabis in mind to make a statement. The fact that McCartney would occasionally smoke joints on his way to the studio during the filming of Help was one of the factors that contributed to his amnesia of lines of dialogue. Richard Lester, the director, overheard an attempt to convince Paul McCartney to experiment with heroin, but he was fiercely opposed to the idea. During the recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Paul McCartney began using cocaine. However, he quickly stopped using it because of the awful sadness it caused him to experience. During the year 1966, McCartney also tried out LSD for the first time. In March of 1967, he went on his second acid trip with John Lennon. When Paul McCartney became the first member of the Beatles to publicly discuss LSD, he asserted that the drug had transformed him into a more moral, tolerant, and honest member of society. During the year 1967, McCartney made a public statement in support of the legalization of cannabis. He supported an advertisement that was published in The Times, which pushed for the legalization of marijuana, the release of those who were incarcerated for possession, and study into the medical applications of medicinal marijuana. In spite of this, his advocacy was not without its effects. The year 1972 saw McCartney get a fine in Sweden for possessing cannabis, and the following year, in 1973, he was found guilty in Scotland of cultivating the narcotic in an illegal manner. Due to the convictions that McCartney received for drug-related offenses, he had trouble obtaining a visa to enter the United States. These problems were not resolved until December 1973. Throughout his life, Paul McCartney has unquestionably been distinguished by a combination of spectacular accomplishments and profound personal struggles. Despite the fact that it may appear that his life has been filled with sorrow as a result of the death of loved ones, the dissolution of relationships, and legal issues, it is essential to consider his narrative in the context of the circumstances surrounding it. Throughout his life, Paul McCartney has demonstrated remarkable resilience. He has gracefully handled both personal and public challenges, and he has continued to create music that has touched the lives of millions of people all over the world. During his formative years, he experienced both tremendous achievement and grief, including the untimely passing of his first wife, Linda, on a terrible occasion. McCartney, on the other hand, did not withdraw from life after experiencing these difficulties. In addition to embracing his role as a grandfather, he remarried, began a new chapter in his life with Nancy Shevell, and did so. In addition, his career exemplifies this tenacity, since he continues to develop as an artist and maintains his relevance throughout a number of generations. Despite the fact that McCartney's participation with drugs and his legal troubles were undoubtedly a part of the turbulent aspects of his life, they also serve to show his readiness to speak out on subjects such as the legalization of cannabis. As a result of his stance on cannabis and his openness to publicly disclose personal issues, including loss, he has become a figure that many fans find more approachable. In the end, it is possible that Paul McCartney's life has been marked by a certain amount of melancholy. Nevertheless, it has also been characterized by love, creativity, and the determination to triumph over challenges. Not only does he continue to motivate others through his music, but he also demonstrates that life can still have significance, especially when confronted with challenging situations. His narrative is one of perseverance, personal development, and finally, success because of his efforts.